Okay, let's get started. Good morning, everyone. My name is Wu Shen, and I'm a faculty member with the Division of Public Policy at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. I'm glad to be the moderator of today's policy dialogue. This is the third year that we run the policy dialogue between the two universities, Education University of Hong Kong and the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. Today's policy dialogue is the sixth one in this year's dialogue series. This is going to be the last as well. And we're going to talk about very important issues concerning the future of Hong Kong. The topic of today's policy dialogue is Hong Kong, China, global city, or just another city of China. At the midst of fighting the COVID pandemic, there are some significant development concerning Hong Kong's future. And one is the enactment of a national security law. The other is the overhaul of the electoral system. At the background, of course, there's also rising US-China geopolitical tensions. And all of this development can have important impact on the development of Hong Kong in the future. So it may take many years to fully understand such impact here, but it's very important to take more efforts and to understand those impacts sooner. So today's policy dialogue brings three distinguished speakers. They are policy scholars. They're also practitioners who have distinguished public services. Right? So I'd like to briefly introduce the three speakers for today's policy dialogue. The first speaker will be Professor Anthony Chong. He is currently the research chair professor of public administration at the Department of Asian and Policy Study at the Education University of Hong Kong. And also he's the adjunct professor of the Division of Public Policy at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. He is the former secretary of Transport and Housing of the government of HKSAR from July 2012 to June 2017. Our second speaker for today's policy dialogue will be Professor K.C. Tian. He is currently adjunct professor of finance at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. He is the former secretary for financial services and treasury at the government of HKSAR from July 2007 to June 2017. Our third speaker will be Professor Song Yun Wing. He's currently an adjunct professor of the Department of Economics at the Chinese University of Hong Kong, and he served as the chairman of the Hong Kong Committee for Pacific Economic Cooperation from 2007 to 2012. Without further ado, I'd like to turn to our first speaker for today's policy dialogue, Professor Anthony Chong, please.
Thank you, Professor Wu. Good morning. As what Professor Wu has said, today we are going to examine the future of Hong Kong as Hong Kong, China. Now, of course, when Hong Kong was reunified with the mainland of China in 1997, Hong Kong was positioned as a global city, and we have all the features of being a global city. But because of what happened in the last couple of years, particularly, and the international reaction to the imposition of a national security law on Hong Kong, there has been much anxiety or uncertainty about Hong Kong's future, whether Hong Kong could still continue as a vibrant global city as before. And also in view of the rise of other major cities on the mainland, particularly Shenzhen, which is next door to Hong Kong. There was even the suggestion that perhaps Hong Kong might lose its advantage to some of these cities. So as what Professor Wu has said, it would take many years for us to actually see through the full implications of what happened in the last couple of years. And of course, what will happen depends a lot on how we take Hong Kong's role from now on, and how we see what Hong Kong can do, whether in the national scene or internationally. So today, in my part, I'm going to sort of examine where we stand as a city. And then the other speakers will also speak on particular aspects of Hong Kong's role as a global city. Let me start by going back to Hong Kong's foundation, so to speak, as a special administrative region of China under one country, two systems. So I'll try to sort of go back to the legacy of the one country, two systems framework. Why one country, two systems? Very, very simply, there are two elements. First, how to deal with Hong Kong's return to China, the historical compromise, so to speak. On the one hand, Hong Kong will return to China. On the other hand, Hong Kong will retain whatever systems, institutions it had at the point of reunification. So that was enshrined in both the Sino-British Joint Declaration as well as the Basic Law of Hong Kong. But the more important element, in my view, particularly with respect to Hong Kong's post-1997 future, is Hong Kong's contribution to China's modernization. And some of us might remember that back in the 1980s, Deng Xiaoping, who was the one largely responsible for pushing this one country, two systems idea, he said several times that he hoped there will be more Hong Kongs on the mainland. So Hong Kong at that time was taken as a kind of role model, if you like, of how a Chinese society could at the same time reach out to the world and be part of the modern world. So Hong Kong's contribution, Hong Kong's role in terms of China's overall modernization is very important. And indeed, Hong Kong has played that role quite well, in my view, of the past couple of decades. And I remember that when the mainland started reform and opening up, Hong Kong business people, Hong Kong professionals, they were the first to sort of enter or to participate in China's modernization process. Now, briefly, under one country, two systems, what we mean by the two systems essentially can be represented by a real distinction between the economic, social, and political systems within Hong Kong as a SAR, and also those systems on the mainland. We are part of the same nation at the same time in terms of the actual systems, institutions concerned. Hong Kong has been quite different. How to maintain difference and at the same time keep integration, unification, I think that is a real challenge to this one country, two systems formula. And at the same time, autonomy and self-administration. So these three elements are essential to the maintenance of the two systems arrangement. But Hong Kong's autonomy, in a way, did not start from zero, because under British rule, Hong Kong had at different points in time been quite a distinct entity, because Hong Kong was able to maintain a rather separate status in terms of trade negotiations, in terms of some external matters. And Hong Kong issued its own currency, own stamps, even under British rule. And Hong Kong was able to maintain its own offices in some overseas countries. And as far as China's policy towards Hong Kong under British rule was concerned, there was this saying, 長期打算充分利用, meaning China would plan long and fully utilize Hong Kong's special role or status. So that was the background to one country, two systems. I think that is very important for us to bear in mind when we ponder the future of Hong Kong. Now, this second slide just summarizes the main features of autonomy in economic and financial affairs, and I'm sure we are very familiar with them. Hong Kong has independent finances and taxation system, separate monetary and financial policies. Hong Kong is a separate customs territory. Hong Kong issues its own currency. Free port. Hong Kong has its own free trade policy. Shipping and civil aviation. Hong Kong maintains a separate shipping register. Hong Kong also is a sort of a separate flight information zone under the ICAO. And this status of Hong Kong, China is in fact stated clearly in the Basic Law. So Hong Kong can conduct some external relations matters under this Hong Kong, China status. And Hong Kong is a full member of WTO and also APEC. And overseas offices, there are now about 13, and another 4 is being planned. So you can see that as a major metropolis of China as a nation, when we compare Hong Kong to other metropolises like London, New York, Hong Kong is quite different. Hong Kong has more autonomy, more sort of internal say over internal administration under the Basic Law. But since 1997, since reunification, we have seen a lot of tensions. Some of these tensions, in my view, are inherent in this one country, two systems formula, and they are unavoidable. So the major challenge is how to manage the tensions. And sometimes tensions are constructive. And because you have differences, therefore, you're bound to have some tensions. Tensions between two systems, tensions between two existentialisms, the way of life, the historical legacy, and so on and so forth. But the more challenging tension comes from this, the fact that the two systems embody two identities, because the Hong Kong identity is recognized as Hong Kong permanent resident under the Basic Law. And this is not because, well, the Chinese in Hong Kong, they are Chinese nationals as well, but they carry a Hong Kong as their passport. So internationally, Hong Kong also keeps somewhat distinct status, distinct identity. And if we don't handle this identity problem or issue well, it may create a lot of debates, tensions, as what we have seen over the last couple of decades. And the issue of patriotism has always been there. even before 1997, but more so after 1997. Normally, we would say it should not be a problem. This is the second question in the fourth bullet here. Don't all countries expect their citizens to be patriotic? We should take that as natural. But somehow it has been an issue. And I think we really need to find out and explore why that is such an issue. And in the process of, after 1997, in the process of reunification, of course, while keeping Hong Kong's distinction, we are also talking about integration. And there are tensions, what I describe as the pain of integration. Integration is necessary, it should be mutually beneficial, and yet it has been an issue. And then politically, the pain of democratization. Article 23 legislation on national security, that was the first, the issue that triggered the first sort of mass protest movement in Hong Kong back in 2003. And then most recently, because Hong Kong had not enacted on Article 23 on national security, therefore the central government, the National People's Congress decided to impose the national security law on Hong Kong. And finally, the authority of the central state under basic law. The basic law is very clear about the authority, the power of the central government. Hong Kong is part of a unitary state of the PRC. We are not part of a federal system, so to speak. But because Hong Kong is a special administrative region, therefore sometimes you can see some traces of Hong Kong somewhat like a part of a federal system. So it's very ambivalent. It's so special that you cannot simply say, use some general political science notions or constitutional notions to describe Hong Kong under one country, two systems. And this is what makes the post-reunification relations challenging. But I think this is also indicative of the innovation of one country, two systems, because this is something which is really unknown in the past. Now, before we come to the main issue, which is whether Hong Kong can continue as a vibrant global city, let's look at the last few years, because this is what we can consider as a game changer. The 2014 Occupy Central movement. Now, since then, the central government in Beijing has become very worried about Hong Kong. The fear of emerging tendencies towards separatism or even self-determination. Therefore, in 2014, the central government issued a white paper on one country, two systems, and that was interpreted by some people in Hong Kong, the pro-democratic camp, as sort of playing up the central authority. So they are worried about whether Hong Kong will lose its autonomy. So this is really interactive. And then in the 2014 white paper, the central government reasserted the notion of comprehensive jurisdiction over Hong Kong. I use the word reasserted because it was not something new. Back in the 1980s, even during the Sino-British talks, during the discussion about the basic law, the formulation of the basic law, actually the notion of comprehensive jurisdiction was already there, because the central government emphasized several times, many times, that China is a unitary state. So there's no notion of residual power in the SAR. And in 2016, President Xi Jinping stated very clearly that there's no room for Hong Kong independence, no compromise on national sovereignty and territorial integrity. So you can see that Beijing was quite worried even then about Hong Kong becoming too sort of independent or too separate, out of control and ungovernable. And even at that time, there was this expression as to whether Hong Kong, what happened in Hong Kong might lead to a kind of color revolution. 2019 somewhat confirmed Beijing's worst fear about Hong Kong. Now, I will not go through the details of what happened, but you can see that because of what happened in 2019 and 2020, Beijing was no longer tolerant of any deviant moves in Hong Kong. That's why they need to impose a national security law from the perspective of the central government. And Beijing has been more active in imposing central guidance within the notion of comprehensive jurisdiction, the role of the liaison office in Hong Kong, the role of the Hong Kong and Macau Affairs Office of the State Council has been sort of strengthened in a way. And the latest move back in March this year was the overhaul of Hong Kong's electoral system to ensure that only patriots administer Hong Kong. So this is the background that leads us to what we are today. So the question is Hong Kong still having the essential elements of a global city as a SAR under one country, two systems? Because some people are suggesting that Hong Kong is now entering one country, one system. The ex-president of the US, Donald Trump, after he said that Hong Kong is into one country, one systems after the national security law was enacted last year. I think it's rather unfortunate that what has happened in Hong Kong and Beijing's reaction towards the incidents, developments in Hong Kong have occurred during a time of rather significant changes in global geopolitics, escalating US-China rivalry, clash of systems, clash of values, and the US reaction towards Hong Kong has been affected not just by developments in Hong Kong, but also determined by how it deals with China. And the US obviously is quite concerned about China's rise. So all this, when all these factors, when they add up, Hong Kong becomes sort of squeezed because of this changing geopolitics, all these tensions. And Hong Kong is, because of the internal dynamics, internal politics within Hong Kong of the last few years, Hong Kong is paying the price of the Lam Chao, the strategy of mutual destruction of the radicals. But at the same time, because of US-China tensions, Hong Kong is also bearing part of the collateral damage. The US has changed its policy towards Hong Kong. Some Western nations, they're also imposing restrictions, not boycotts on Hong Kong because of overall assessment of the situation. Now, such international or Western reaction might affect how Hong Kong will be treated internationally in future, or even now. Now, whether or not they will actually, they have actually affected Hong Kong's trade relations, I think that is something that we need to look at more concretely, not just in vague ideas. We really need to look at the statistics. But the challenge is, the threat is, whether Hong Kong might become hollowed out. If we have some businesses, if they leave Hong Kong, if talent, if they migrate from Hong Kong, if the international community has less confidence in Hong Kong's future, if the international community has less confidence in autonomy in Hong Kong, then Hong Kong's international status might be eroded. At the same time, if Beijing does not trust Hong Kong enough, that may also affect whether the central government would allow Hong Kong to have as much autonomy or free space as before. So the threat comes from several angles. Beijing's distrust, Beijing's attitude towards Hong Kong, the Western attitude, whether boycotts will be a feature, uncertainties in terms of Hong Kong's integration with the nation, particularly regional integration, the GBA, the Greater Bay Area integration. Now, at the moment, on the surface, things do not look good, because right now we are seeing the reaction of the central government towards Hong Kong because of the concern about Hong Kong's development, the lack of trust, if you like. So the question is whether that situation is beyond reconciliation and repair. So in other words, we want to make sure that Hong Kong can continue to thrive as the global city of China, then we have to do something. We have to really work hard towards reconciliation and repair. In terms of Western sanctions boycotts, whether Hong Kong can tell a better story about where we are, how we are going to move into the future, and how do we enable the international community to understand Hong Kong better, to understand Hong Kong's advantage, Hong Kong's contribution better. In terms of integration, GBA, for example, at the moment, the notion of GBA integration is being looked at quite differently between the business sector and some ordinary citizens, because the business sector would see that as an opportunity, but some people might see that as a threat. So I think we need, within Hong Kong, we need to really think deeper about this integration thing. We need to take the opportunity, or this is the very important juncture in time for Hong Kong to reinvent itself within the region, to play out its role of serving national needs where Hong Kong is the best. This is the sort of urge by Premier Li Keqiang several years ago. So we have to examine where does Hong Kong's comparative advantage lie, and what is Hong Kong's relative value to China? Is it on decline, or have we sort of re-established Hong Kong's value to China in terms of the nation's overall growth and modernization? We have to reinstill confidence in Hong Kong's institutions. There are many reports, including reports in the international press, media, about the erosion of Hong Kong institutions. Some of these are sort of imagined, perceived, or maybe some are real to some extent because of certain events or incidents. So we need really to look deeper. We need to be clearer about the actual functioning of Hong Kong's institutions. So my final slide here, on the left-hand side, these are some of the elements of what I would say a doomsday scenario. Hong Kong there's no future, because Hong Kong is into one country, one system. The central government no longer trusts Hong Kong people. So concerned about national security. Therefore, in future, everything is defined by national security, and Hong Kong ceases to be an international hub because the foreign community, the international community, does not have as much confidence as in Hong Kong as previously. Capital, talent, they are moving out of Hong Kong. Hong Kong will become secondary to Shenzhen within the GBA, institutional breakup. All these are rather extreme, and in my view, exaggerated descriptions of a doomsday scenario. I do not buy that description, this scenario. But at the same time, in order to ensure that Hong Kong is as distinct, vibrant, and global as before under one country, two systems, then we have to think hard as to what kind of one country, two systems we are talking about in the next few decades. I think certainly one country, two systems has entered version 2.0. Not in terms of whether there are changes in the essence of one country, two systems, but the background, the context has changed because after all, we are now 20 odd years after 1997. So perhaps it will be useful for us to examine what are the features, what are the challenges to one country, two systems in this 2.0 version within the red lines imposed by the central government regarding national security, sovereignty, and the party-state system of the PRC. The trust issue between the mainland and Hong Kong, Beijing as the central government and the SL government. I think we must try hard to establish trust. And I think even now, conditional trust can still be developed, but it requires better mutual understanding of opportunities and limitations. The central government, in my view, still values the positive side of plurality in Hong Kong, freedoms, judicial independence, and common law system. But at the same time, it might become anxious about certain developments in Hong Kong. So we need to really reassure the central government that Hong Kong is still very mindful of its contribution to national progress. In terms of Hong Kong's status as an international hub, I think it is somewhat a paradox. Without mainland advantage, in other words, our proximity to the mainland, our role within China's overall plan of development, Hong Kong cannot sustain its global city. Hong Kong is not a global city if it is not part of China. But if we are just sort of active in internal circulation, this is a new term of the dual or double circulation strategy of China today after COVID-19. If we are just active in internal circulation, I think we also at the same time dilute Hong Kong's global features and global advantage. So we need to keep both. And we need to retain capital and talent despite the some sentiments of pessimism. So how do we enable people to think more positive? How do we define more clearly the challenge or the challenges we are facing? And whether Hong Kong will become secondary within the GBA, I think that is a very concrete, specific challenge. But there's one thing that we can be very certain about. Under the Basic Law, Hong Kong enjoys special treatment. Hong Kong can do things that cities like Shanghai, Shenzhen cannot do. Now, whether or not we can take full advantage of such special status under the Basic Law, I think that's something up to Hong Kong. And of course, with the passing of the central government. So in other words, cities are rising on the mainland, but that does not mean that Hong Kong's importance will be diluted, of course, depending on what Hong Kong will do in the future. And finally, institutional breakup. I mean, this is the doomsday scenario. I don't think this is happening now, but of course, nothing is certain. It all depends on the efforts of the local population as well as the efforts of Beijing to keep Hong Kong institutions as vibrant as possible. So, and Hong Kong needs to assert its voice and visibility within the nations. Let the mainland, let other parts of the nation know Hong Kong better. I think that's important. In the past, perhaps, in my view, Hong Kong has not done enough in terms of interacting with the mainland, in terms of letting other parts of the nation to know Hong Kong better. I think it's time, because of what happened in the last few years, it's time that we do better sort of internal diplomacy. This is a term used by the former CE, C.Y. Leung, better internal diplomacy, so that other parts of the nation can share the Hong Kong story in a more positive way. So because of time, I think I'll stop here, and later on during the Q&A, I can supplement with more comments. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Anthony Chan. And I just wanted to say that for those of you who are participating as our audience, we do encourage you to put down your question. This is a policy dialogue, so we intend to have dialogue among the three speakers, but also importantly, we would like to hear from your question, and the speakers will try to attend to your question at the end of the presentation here. So please put in your question in Q&A or chat box in Zoom. Now I'd like to turn to our second speaker of the policy dialogue, Professor Casey Chan, please.
Oh, hi. First of all, thank you, Anthony, for inviting me to this panel. Yan-Wing and Anthony, sorry I cannot join you physically, but I really enjoy this. Enjoy your opening speech. I think the larger question that you're posing here is whether Hong Kong will be make a global city or become a Chinese city. I think, as I suppose, there are many aspects to this question, including the identity of Hong Kong, the way to live, or political governance, and so on. It's a very big question, and for my talk, I will focus on just one important aspect of Hong Kong as a global city, which is, what makes Hong Kong a global financial center, and whether Hong Kong will lose their status, becoming quote unquote just another Chinese city. But let's just look at the history of Hong Kong as a global financial center, and I would say that history is very, very short. Back in the early 1990s, when I started teaching HKUST, I would say Hong Kong wasn't regarded to be a global financial center. Many of the investment banks, Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, and so on, they established in Hong Kong mainly for the business in Japan. Okay, and then looking at potential emergence of business in China. So Japan, Tokyo was a much bigger market, and but Hong Kong has some advantage because of our English language proficiency, and easy way of life and so on. Some of the foreign bankers may want to be in Hong Kong, covering Asia, but largely over that last 30 years, there's always been some debate among many people. Is Hong Kong a global financial center? Is it Hong Kong? Is it Tokyo? Is it Singapore? Is it Shanghai? And so on. So Hong Kong, no doubt today is a global financial center. Let me just try to share the screen here. Maybe I can get it. So that's my title. Okay. So really, the larger question here is who is the global financial center in Asia? As I said earlier, it's a lot of debate. Even Shanghai was regarded to be a potential up and coming star, and because Shanghai is bigger in domestic finance and RMB equity, and so on, and potentially one day Shanghai can overtake Hong Kong to be the global center. But the point is, when you define a financial center, there are always many rivals to Hong Kong, and each of them, Hong Kong, Tokyo, Shanghai, Singapore, has its own strengths and weaknesses, and not all of them are entirely alike. So I'm trying to compare, by comparing Hong Kong with these cities, I try to really ask the question, really what makes Hong Kong tick, and whether we can keep that characteristic, and what is a threat to Hong Kong status in the future. Now, Anthony started off a number of factors, which is defining Hong Kong's success as a global city, as a important economic hub, and I think this is a very common narrative of Hong Kong's factors for success. I think obviously when you come to the financial market, freedom of movement of capital is very, very important. Hong Kong enjoy that capital mobility, which is also enshrined in the basic law. Transparent regulation is very important to finance, and that also includes a very clean and effective government. Common law is very often cited as a bedrock of Hong Kong identity, and I think that especially that is very important in Hong Kong financial market development, and because of the common law linkage, it's easier for many of the financial markets which are based in the common law jurisdictions to conduct business in Hong Kong. And I said earlier, part of the early advantage of Hong Kong is our historical and cultural link to the West. So that makes it easier for foreign companies to operate in Hong Kong. Low tax is actually important because that's, if you compare tax in Hong Kong and tax in Tokyo or tax in Shanghai, that's clearly give Hong Kong a leg over the potential competition. But very importantly, as Anthony pointed out in his talk, China is the biggest factor. It's a very important factor, I should say. Without China, Hong Kong financial market will be very, very small. Today, as you can see, the equity listed in Hong Kong exchange, of that, maybe 70–80% is coming from the mainland firms, and asset management will also include a lot of the Chinese companies and so on. So and a lot of the foreign companies established in Hong Kong because they're covering China, and a lot of the Chinese companies are going out to the West through Hong Kong. So clearly, without China, Hong Kong would not be anywhere near a global financial center. So that's very important. But also I want to talk about what happens to the global financial system over the last 30 years or so. I mean, around the same time as Hong Kong is emerging as a global financial market, around the same time when I talk about all these Goldmans, Morgan Stanley, and people coming to Hong Kong and try to really operate in this trade in the Tokyo market, something's happening in the global system of finance. The deregulation and political recognition, that financing is important, and also technology development allows fundraising taking place around the world. It wasn't like that in the 70s, it wasn't like that in the 80s, but from the 90s on, you have fundraising, you have trading around the clock. At that time, the technology was much slower than today, but still people were using terminals, Reuters, that's probably beginning of Bloomberg, and starting to trade financial assets. Capital becomes very mobile around the world, and people and a lot of traders and banks want to take advantage of that by establishing trading centers, in everywhere, around the world. And Hong Kong really benefit from that globalization. But the globalization of finance led to many problems that later on we all recognized, starting from the Asian financial crisis in the 1997, 98 year period. You see a collapse in exchange rates. You see which plunged many governments' finances into big problems, dropping in GDP and so on, and bank failures and so on. So that really it really caused all the governments and banks to realize that the global financial system is actually very fragile, even though it's very profitable, but very fragile. So the financial system actually began to really develop a lot of regulation, cooperation, and also basically the standard setting among governments in order to cope with this emergence. Because and financial crisis are very occur quite frequently, or more frequently than we expected. You have the Asian financial crisis, and then later on, of course, you have a global financial crisis, which took place in 2008, and that even caused a huge economic problem on a global scale. So because of these many crises, big crises, small crises, and the recognition that finance is very fragile and capital moves too fast, we actually saw a development of a global regulatory system, in over the last 20 of some years. And I mentioned some of these committees and institutions which are responsible for this international regulation. Of course, starting with G20, which has become very active after the global financial crisis. The Financial Stability Board, which is set a lot of the macroprudential regulatory this policy. Basel Committee that sets banks' capital standard. The IOSCO, which is the International Organization of Securities Commissions, which is a body that coordinate among all the securities regulators. The point to make here is that the global financial system is becoming very integrated, and each of the markets become highly dependent on the other, and the system is so fragile that you need a coordinated policy to ensure that, or try to ensure that no failures will happen. But at the same time, the push behind this regulation or the regulatory system is also the need for countries to agree on some common standard, not only regarding stability, but regarding on the economics of finance, or the business interest of finance. For example, some of the rules set in today's world, besides stability consideration, is also because countries like US or some of the European major EU countries do not want to see other countries, by using a different capital standard or different kind of different financial margins, to give benefits to their own companies in competing in the international financial system. So it's agreement on how we set the parameters, how do we set up the business arrangement, so that there is no quote unquote unfair competition, okay, in the name of protecting the stability of the system. So it's a very very highly coordinated, complex web of regulation. And also the last one I want to mention is Financial Action Task Force, which look at the AML regime, and then the proliferation of weapons financing and so on. And this is, of course, coming mainly from the US agenda, AML and proliferation. But then it becomes really a big international organization which audit every country to make sure that they are compliant with these FATF objectives. And then another thing that's going to becoming more important is the tax policy or the tax coordination. It started with like OECD trying to really establish some kind of minimum tax or some taxation or tax policies around the world, and then now it's backed up by Biden administration in the US and of moving towards some kind of a global minimum tax. So is stability is also financial interest of the larger powers set the rules and so on, which really define this sort of global financial system. Now, I would say Hong Kong actually is doing quite well in this system because as the system developed, Hong Kong also emerging as a international financial center, and our regulators and government was very active, in participating in these events, and because of the competence of our market participants and the competence of our market regulators, Hong Kong actually play a role in this system, perhaps bigger than the size of a city. The point is, we are very much part of that, and we are very much responsible for some of these policy setting. Now, so the point I'm making here is, so Hong Kong's success as international financial center clearly is derived from the earlier factors that I mentioned. The China factor, the low tax, the capital mobility, and so on. But we are also part of this global regulatory system that is defining the nature of our global financial market. Okay, it's much more than just it's like WTO, but it's much stronger than WTO in terms of how we link up with other bodies. So in terms of the constitutional arrangement, Hong Kong is clearly part of China. It's a China city. But in terms of how Hong Kong conducts financial transaction, Hong Kong is linked up to the world system and occupies a central place in it. So long as there's a need for China to have international financial market, Hong Kong should be in the best position to play the role. And even as Shanghai grows in importance as a financial center, which is already is, there's a different role that Hong Kong plays, which Shanghai today cannot replace. I remember back in the government days, around 2010, just in the wake of the global financial crisis, I was trying to work with the other bodies in the government to promote Hong Kong as a financial center. We're doing road shows around the world, trying to really regain some confidence in Hong Kong, regain confidence in the financial market in the wake of the global financial crisis. And I brainstormed with my colleagues and about what Hong Kong really was. This is back 11 years ago. And we debated a lot of the same points. And I came up with one description of Hong Kong, which is the following. I said Hong Kong is China's global financial center. So we are Hong Kong, but we are China, and we are representing China global financial market. Now, which is not to dismiss another city like Shanghai, but we recognize that Shanghai on its own, we recognize Shanghai on its own is an important financial market, but it's important will grow as Shanghai grows, as China grows, but clearly we really saw Hong Kong playing a very different role, and we want to talk about Hong Kong being China's global financial market, both externally to the Western countries, as well as internally in our so-called internal diplomacy with mainland authorities, trying to really play up Hong Kong's role in this regard. So that's how that's how I saw the Hong Kong financial market development and positioning. Now, that was that title. So let's consider the flip side of my the question. Let's imagine what will make Hong Kong lose our international financial center characteristics. So let me look at all this issue again. Which one is really critical? Without that, Hong Kong will lose our status, and then which one is maybe not so critical, nice to have. Now, clearly, the list is actually very similar with some omission. No, of course, freedom of movement of capital is very critical. Without that, you cannot claim to be a financial market, global financial market. And freedom of capital movement, I think that's very much enshrined in the basic law, and I think I really don't see any reason for that to change. Low tax, nice to have, but many countries, many financial markets have much higher tax in Hong Kong. So even if we have to raise tax a little bit, I think you hurt the business a bit, perhaps, but I don't think you really change it's not a critical factor. It's nice to have factor when you compete on the markets, but it's not a most critical factor. Next one is controversial, maybe. English language. I call it nice to have. It's not critical because it's, of course, when you're conducting international transactions, you need people who can speak English. But you find them in Tokyo, you find them in Shanghai, you find them in many places. You find them in European capital centers. So yes, it's nice to have. This was something that I believe Hong Kong also retain in a center. But in terms of the most critical factor, I don't think it's the most critical factor. Common law, yes, critical. Now I put a parenthesis around it, not because it's not so critical, it's critical, but I want to make a point that many of the financial centers do not have common law. Okay, European countries don't have common law. Japan, can be Japan doesn't have common law, and in the future, I regard Shanghai to be a very possible global financial center, and of course without common law. Okay, now the point is not to say that common law is not important. Common law is Hong Kong's heritage. We have common law. It's not going to change, and that is very critical. To keep that kind of rule of law and transparency as our characteristics. Access to information, I think, is very highly critical, especially for financial market. And then the global standard regulation is very critical. Now, what that means is because finance, as I described earlier, we are really in a part of the whole, financial system around the world. So number one, you really have to follow the international standard. There's no way around it. If you try to really get around in the international standard, you will get crushed. As I said earlier, it's part of the standard which maintains stability, but also managing competing economic interests in different bodies. So that's very important. And also a global standard regulation also means transparent regulation that people can really follow. China as economic power is highly critical, of course. Without China as a economic power, Hong Kong has really no role to play. Now, having said that, then let me just talk about the potential problems. Okay, I just spread the U.S.-China tensions. You can be more broad than U.S.-China. You can be China and the West and so on. But I just call it the U.S.-China tensions. How will this affect Hong Kong? Now, it's a difficult issue, okay, because we cannot really imagine the total potential possible consequences or fallouts of the U.S.-China tensions and how that will impact the the way that we do our business in Hong Kong. I imagine sanctions, for example, sanctions may affect the relation between China and Western countries. It may affect investment flows, and to some extent, it may even cause some kind of decoupling, economic decoupling between U.S. and China, or China with respect to other countries. So that may have some consequences in terms of the individual companies or investment flows, or some kind of financial institutions are not permitted to operate certain business, so on. But that sanctions or that type of matters, that kind of tools, I really don't see it affecting, the causing a reversal in the global finance. So the global finance is very tight. Is really relies on a system and rely on capital mobility, and so a set of rules. I really don't see tensions can number one, change the system, and number two, I really don't see that it's in the interest of anybody to really try to affect a reversal in a global finance. So we may see that U.S.-China tension will cause volatility in our financial market. That's very easy, and which will hurt Hong Kong stock market or investment sentiment. So Hong Kong business fortunes, in terms of how much money we make in the capital market, may rise and fall, affected by the investment opportunities that come and go with the sanctions or lift of sanctions. It may be, but I cannot imagine the U.S. or the Western countries will try to design a new system to counter China's power. I don't imagine they can really come to design new financial system that will really limit China's rise. And I don't imagine the Western countries can try to change existing rules in the financial system to do just that. Because as I mentioned earlier, the financial system rules and integration that we have seen is really very important to keep enhanced stability of different markets. And all these financial markets are highly dependent on each other. A collapse in one market will cause damage, turmoil in the other financial markets. And financial markets is actually very fragile. Investment sentiment is very fragile. So any kind of moves that will underline that is very highly risky to the system, as well as to each country's interests. And as I also mentioned earlier, the financial system is designed to level the playing field, so that no economy to gain advantage on the other economy by adopting looser policy. So you really want to design a system so that everyone is coming in, bound by the system, so there's no quote-unquote unfair competition. And for the U.S., having a financial system with U.S. dollar dominance give it extra advantage. And to continue with the system, U.S. would want to encourage countries, including China, to use the U.S. dollars and to purchase a U.S. government debt and to participate in the U.S. dollar system. And to design financial market rules so that Chinese banks must follow, with similar capital requirement and risk control measures, so these Chinese banks will not gain advantage over the U.S. banks. So that means that you want a system where China is in it, rather than China is not in it. So that's my feeling. That's my my perspective on how the financial system will do, even with U.S.-China tensions. And that perhaps is a good news for Hong Kong, because I really don't see in the near future even Shanghai is gaining advantage as a global financial center, which I think one day it will be. But in the near future, Hong Kong is is very much integrated into this system, and China can use Hong Kong as a global financial center rather easily, and rather and the access is highly assured. So really is I think that's probably goodness for Hong Kong. So Hong Kong, I believe Hong Kong is has always been China's global financial center. We are part of China. We should not take side of Western powers in terms of our politics. We shouldn't give Western powers a leverage in the opposition to China. We are at the same time an integral part of the Western system. The rules of the games are set to lead to stability, as well as manage the economic interests of different countries. So perhaps I go back to my thesis. Hong Kong is China's global financial center, and I think I'm quite positive that we will remain that for a long time. So that's my talk, and we were happy to participate in the discussions.
For the discussion of the Hong Kong's role as China's global financial center. So let's now turn to our third speaker of the policy dialogue, Professor Sun, please.
Sharing. Thanks for Professor Anthony Chung's invitation to speak here. Well, my job is easier in that I have two previous speakers that already cover a lot of ground. I mean, Anthony, covered the macro perspective of politics, foreign relations, and so on. There's Professor 𝐇𝐨𝐧𝐠, cover the ground in finance. So I myself, being an economist, I will talk about the economy, but not so much about finance, because Professor Chen is a much better expert than myself. Okay, so the title of my talk is Hong Kong's economic position in the context of one country, two systems. Since 1949, Hong Kong has been China's most open, national, and cosmopolitan city. And Hong Kong's role as China's gateway has been of tremendous value to both China and the West. Now, is this position under threat? Well, I put here three developments that our previous speakers already talked about. Well, the first one, US-China's geopolitical contest, making life uncomfortable for Hong Kong, obviously, but Hong Kong being the gateway, connecting China with the world. The second development, increasing openness and competitiveness of mainland cities, that really Hong Kong is lagging behind and they are no longer important. And thirdly, Beijing's alarm over Hong Kong's separatist sentiments, enactment of national security law, and overhaul of the electoral system. How do these three developments impact on our position? Well, assessing impacts of above are difficult as too many uncertainties, variables are involved. However, I'm going to do three things. Number one, look at history, the effect of previous political and economic shocks on Hong Kong, and how bad are those? In comparison, to the shock that we have right now. And secondly, I look at performance of latest economic indicators in finance, trade, foreign investment, etc. I mean, how the economy is performing. I mean, reacting to the latest developments. And then I'm looking into the quality of institutions in Hong Kong. I mean, do we have a long-term comparative advantage? So, first look at history. I mean, in Hong Kong's history, we have frequent episodes of a crisis, of emigration, of financial panic, and also capital flight. Specifically, I mean, a crisis of the 1967 riot. There was emigration, real estate prices collapsed, and evidence of capital flight at that time. 1983 Sino-British negotiation, when the Hong Kong dollar, I mean, it fell to 9.5, I mean, US dollar. I mean, obvious financial panic, 89 Tiananmen incident also, I mean, impact on the real estate market and so on. And the 1997 Asian financial crisis, when the Hong Kong dollar interest rate momentarily shot up to 280% on 23rd October. I mean, so I mean, quite a few previous economic or political crises where they have very obvious financial dislocation, drop in real estate prices, I mean, which is long-term investment. I mean, it's a good indicator of investor sentiment. But we are getting none of those right now. So it is not obvious, at least, I mean, on a macro perspective, that the economy is breaking down. There is no obvious sign of capital flight. Hong Kong dollar has been very stable, in fact, on the strong side. Interest rates are low, and so on. And residential property prices have held up, despite the fact that they fall in 67, early 1980s, and fell in after 10 after the Asian financial crisis, but not now. Now look at history. Severity of US sanctions on China or Hong Kong. In 1951, with China's entry into Korean War, US forbade trade with China. US embargo, no, not the US, I mean the UN, United Nations, I mean the whole world, in fact, embargo all exports of strategic materials to China. At that time, both China's trade with the free world and Hong Kong's entrepreneurial trade were more or less gone. Presently, despite US-China trade war and US sanctions against China and also Hong Kong, both mainland's and Hong Kong's trade are, I think, and in fact, performing extremely well, performing much better than world trade, as I will detail in the following slides. Okay. Secondly, we can look at the performance of economic indicators, list of economic indicators. Finance, I will largely skip. I mean, because Tian talked a lot about those. But if I just mention a few, I mean, we are still ranking very well. The Global Financial Center Index, I mean, Hong Kong, IPOs are, I think, financial markets in Hong Kong are still extremely profitable right now. That enterprises are standing in line, I mean, to get listed. Now, I'm going to talk about trade. It is important for Hong Kong, especially exports. I'm going to talk about foreign direct investment, FDI, and other indicators. Okay, look at performance of trade. Trade first. Why trade? Well, trade and logistics have long been the largest sector of Hong Kong economy, number one among 4 key industries. Share of trade in Hong Kong's GDP and employment, 21% for GDP, close to 19% for employment. But in terms of contribution to GDP, trade and finance are head-to-head, about the same right now. In terms of employment, contribution of trade is much bigger. Trade data, I have a lot of slides on trade because I mean, we really know what is going on, that we have a good time series on trade since 1952, I mean, for Hong Kong. And of course, mainland and Hong Kong are separate custom territories, so Hong Kong's trade with the mainland is regarded as external trade. Now, the first thing I want to talk about trade is I look at the effect of 7 major post-war shocks on the growth rate of Hong Kong exports. And if we go down to I look at number 1, Korean War, Cold War, number 2, the 1957 US recession, Asian financial crisis, terrorist attack on New York, I mean September 11th, global financial crisis, US-China trade war, and then the year 2020 should be the worst. I mean, for our economy, there's trade war plus COVID-19. But the effect on Hong Kong exports, if you look at the growth rate, the US-China trade war led to a contraction in Hong Kong's export by 4.1%. It's quite bad, but not as bad as all previous shocks. Okay. If you like the Korean War, okay, 1952 to 54, it led to a contraction of more than 20% on Hong Kong's merchandise exports. Well, last year, trade war plus COVID-19, it led to a contraction of 1.5% in exports, I mean, quite small. And the US-China trade war, the impact is bigger, but not, I mean, much less severe than all previous political or financial or economic crisis that Hong Kong has gone through. Okay, quite surprising. Well, effect of trade war plus COVID-19 quite mild. It's what growth from these 2 years. That is US-China trade war plus COVID-19. In fact, of course, world trade, not just for Hong Kong or China. If you look at world trade contracted by 3% in 2019 due to the US-China trade war. And then it contracted by another 5% or so due to COVID-19. And so if you take the 2 years together, world trade contracted by 8.1%. Okay. Quite bad for the whole world. Mainland, positive growth of 4%. China is only the major economy in the world that managed to achieve positive export growth with COVID-19. Okay, and Hong Kong also quite bad, negative 5.55%, but better than world average. And that is largely because of China, of course. That half of Hong Kong's trade is accounted for China. And that in the recent crisis, mainland exports have performed well, and that boosted Hong Kong's performance. So despite COVID-19, I mean, our exports just shrank by 1.5%. The performance is much better, of course, than tourism and whatever, or air transport, which shrank by 99%. Something, okay. Looking at performance of trade, comparing Hong Kong's trade to mainland, I just start with Hong Kong's version and then up to last year. So both mainland and Hong Kong are big traders. Of course, Hong Kong is big due to China. In year 2020, China is world's #1 in world merchandise trade. China, for quite a few years, China has been world's #1. And importantly, in year 2020, which is an extremely bad year because of COVID-19, Hong Kong is ranked in the world last year with #6, which broke all previous records. Okay, that before 2020, COVID-19 year, Hong Kong never achieved this #6 rank. Okay. We were still back. I mean, we were #8, #9, #10. Our rank in 2020 was the best in our history. Okay, that we were #6. We were ahead of France, surprising. UK, Korea, and Italy, but behind USA, Germany, Japan, and Netherlands. So Hong Kong is extremely big in those things. Well, besides merchandise trade, okay, imports or exports going through Hong Kong customs, that is the definition of merchandise trade. Hong Kong's trading firms also handle large volumes of offshore trade that do not go through Hong Kong. In fact, the Hong Kong's offshore trade is as big as Hong Kong's merchandise trade. By offshore trade, I mean it's something. For example, I mean goods made in the mainland exported from Yantian directly to New York or San Francisco, but handled by trading firms in Hong Kong. Okay, that is offshore trade. And Hong Kong's offshore trade is effective. Offshore trade is largely trade in services. I mean, in essence, it's as big as merchandise trade. But this rank of number 6 only includes merchandise trade. It doesn't include. So if you add offshore trade, in fact, Hong Kong is much bigger. Well, look at performance of trade, comparing Hong Kong to the mainlands since Hong Kong's reversion. Okay, so here, I mean, this graph is the red part is Hong Kong's merchandise trade. Okay, the blue part, in deep blue or purple, is Hong Kong's offshore trade. So if you add offshore trade, is as big as merchandise trade, and the tallest bar in light blue is mainland trade. Okay. So if you take the latest year data that we have is year 2019, because we don't yet have data on offshore trade for year 2020, and here is survey data. That kind of offshore trade is as big as merchandise trade in Hong Kong, and if you add together, it's about half mainland trade. Okay. Which is big, of course. I mean, because mainland is number 1 trader. Okay. Well, if you look at the early years of Hong Kong's reversion, I mean, mainland trade has grown much faster than mainland trade has grown extremely fast. But in the last few years, it hasn't grown fast. I mean, that which is only natural. I mean, the mainland already being world's number 1 trader, you cannot expect to have hyper growth. But if you take China's entry to WTO in year 2001, since 2001 to around 2010 or so, mainland trade has grown extremely fast. But both mainland trade and Hong Kong trade did not grow so fast in the last 5. I mean, ever since 2008, I guess. I mean, global financial crisis. So since 2014, there's open and Hong Kong trade. But if you take the last 5 or 6 years, 7 years, Hong Kong's trade remain more or less half as large. I mean, so this is a ratio of Hong Kong's to mainland trade. This graph, okay. The deep purple thing is Hong Kong's merchandise trade. The light blue thing is offshore trade. You add that together, this orange brown line is offshore trade plus merchandise trade of Hong Kong trade. This line here is 50% of mainland trade. So the ratio of Hong Kong trade to mainland trade for the last 6-7 years is more or less 50%. Didn't change much. So in the last decade, in fact 10 years, Hong Kong's merchandise and offshore trade each around a quarter of mainland trade. So if we add them together, I mean, around half. So the ratio has been quite stable, declining slightly, but not that much. Well, for the performance of trade, I can compare China's trade via Hong Kong and Shanghai. How much of China's trade is traded in Hong Kong? How much of it is traded via Shanghai? In 1997, share of China's trade via Hong Kong reached a peak of 60%. It's been large. Hong Kong handled the bulk of China's trade. That is Hong Kong exports plus offshore trade. So which around 30%. Share via Shanghai in that year was 18%. Hong Kong share declined sharply to 22% in year 2013, but has since been stable, still 22% in 2019. So for the last 7 years, Hong Kong handled a bit more than one-fifth of Chinese trade. Shanghai's trade was also quite stable, 20% in year 2019, still slightly less than Hong Kong. Shanghai share was 18% in 1997. It was 20% in 2019, so stable, slightly less than that of Hong Kong. Now, of course, China's trade has expanded extremely fast. Shanghai's trade also expanded extremely fast. The Shanghai share was stable in the last 35 years or so. Hong Kong share declined from the peak of 60%, but has been stable in the last 7 years or so. If people look at these statistics, they may be extremely surprised. I mean, that somehow, Hong Kong, Hong Kong still handle more of China's trade than Shanghai. All of us know that Shanghai is way ahead in container throughput, much bigger than Hong Kong. Okay, but Hong Kong is ahead in air cargo, which is more valuable. For the last 5-6 years, the value of Hong Kong exports by air is 3 times, nearly triple of that by sea. So Hong Kong mostly export by air, in terms of value. And of course, Hong Kong also handle a large amount of offshore trade that does not go through Hong Kong. And that is why Hong Kong still handles more of China's trade than Shanghai. Okay. Now, summary, steep decline in early years is natural. Hong Kong will sink under the weight of container cargo. The bulk of China's trade continues to Hong Kong. That is not viable. And Hong Kong is no longer competitive in transporting maritime cargo, but is competitive in air cargo, in maritime services, and a lot of trading services to China. Hong Kong is #1 in international air cargo, and Hong Kong's international flight links vastly exceed those of Shanghai. Is something like 130 to 50 or 60. And the basic reason for this was Hong Kong has autonomy to conclude air flight agreements due to one country, 2 systems, while Shanghai has to compete with Beijing and Guangzhou to share mainland's flight links. So Hong Kong has a special advantage here. So Shanghai in maritime services. So Hong Kong performed well in trade. So that's repeating. And despite US-China trade war and COVID-19, mainland and Hong Kong trade have performed better than world trade. And then we look at the COVID-19, goods trade versus services trade. Okay, export of goods in year 2020, world negative growth 5%, mainland positive. Hong Kong slightly negative, but much better than world trade, and that is because of China, of course. An impact of pandemic on goods trade has been much less than that of services trade, because goods trade is more arm's length. Services trade require person-to-person contacts. So if you look at tourism, air flights, and more collapse. And the good performance of goods trade act as an important economic stabilizer for Hong Kong. Were it not for the good performance of goods trade, our economy would be much worse. Okay, performance and recovery from pandemic. So first quarter dated this year, mainland's exports rose by staggering close to 40%. Mainland's GDP rose by close to 20%, shattering historical record. And boosted by mainland's performance, Hong Kong's exports soared by 30%. GDP jumped by 7.88%, strongest in 10 years. And China's extremely good performance, of course, was due to successful containment of pandemic earlier than most of the rest of the world. Okay? And it accounts for China's extremely good performance. In fact, the trade war has, for the United States, the trade war has failed in all essential purposes. Last year, China's bilateral surplus with the US broke all historical record. If the purpose of all these sanctions against China and Hong Kong were to diminish the bilateral surplus of China with the US or to bring jobs to the US, it all failed spectacularly. Foreign direct investment, both Hong Kong and Hong Kong went very high. In terms of FDI flows, mainland surpassed USA to be #1 in FDI in the whole world in 2020. And mainland ranked #2 in our FDI. And Hong Kong also ranked high. Hong Kong was the world's 3rd largest host after US and UK, the world's 6th largest investor. And it's very big. And Hong Kong is big in FDI because China is big. Okay? There are a lot of this. The Hong Kong serves as an investment platform for companies going into China and also going out from China to the world. And it also attests to the strength of Hong Kong as an international financial center. And in recent years, Hong Kong's share of mainland's inward FDI rose to over 70%, breaking records of the early reform era. So even if you went back to 1979 or Deng Xiaoping's 1992, Hong Kong's share of mainland inward FDI has broken all historical records. It attests to the strength of Hong Kong as an international financial center. Okay, and competitive headquarters of multinational foreign companies in Hong Kong is an important indicator. Also update because it's a survey data. If you take the number of foreign companies in Hong Kong, it's been going up and up and up most of the time, excepting for the COVID-19 years. And also for the global financial crisis year, it went down a bit. Otherwise, it went up. Well, lastly, very fast, quality of institutions. This is long term. Okay? But Hong Kong institutions are not superior to mainlands in every way. Of course, Hong Kong's decision process, for example, tends to be slower than mainlands. However, Hong Kong's institutions are certainly unique in China. We have almost complete free flow of capital, trade, and information, greatest transparency and international connectivity, practice of common law, high protection of private property, and so on. And this uniqueness have evolved out of long process of Hong Kong's development. They have also been carefully protected under the basic law. Now, uniqueness is not automatically an advantage, but it can often be turned into an advantage. And due to its uniqueness, Hong Kong is often strong where the mainland is weak. Hong Kong is often strong where the mainland is weak. For example, 44 years into China's opening, Beijing still has no timetable for capital account convertibility, whereas Hong Kong has completely free capital flows. So naturally, Hong Kong is the premier center for China to raise international capital. Hong Kong is weak. Hong Kong is strong there. China is weak. And Chinese leaders appear to be cognizant of Hong Kong's uniqueness and strengths. For example, after the passage of the National Security Law, that was July last year. After, that all this talk about patriots governing Hong Kong, there are talks that patriots governing Hong Kong should not apply only to the government, it should also apply to important institutions such as like the Hong Kong Exchange or the SFC, okay, the Securities Commission, okay, but that didn't turn out. That a foreign face, okay, Nicholas Abusi, a non-Chinese, will take over the leadership of Hong Kong from Charles 𝐿𝐴⁴ who is a Chinese national and who should be a patriot, right? Charles 𝐿𝐴ⴤ a few days, the change in office will be May 23rd, I mean, 2 weeks down the road, or something like that. And other non-Chinese, actually, elder who was due to step down as CEO, need to step down in September. His appointment extended for 3 years. So all these very important, I mean, appointments, I mean, are still foreign faces. In fact, change from a Chinese face to a foreign face, I mean, for the Hong Kong. Yes, okay. Quality of institutions. Professionalism and standards are also Hong Kong's institutional strength. Hong Kong is unique in China's in the quality and standards of medical services and other professional services, I mean, accounting, whatever. And Beijing appears to be cognizant that Hong Kong has strength in basic research in universities. While mainland universities are well funded, the success indicator syndrome inherent in command economies hampered full realization of the potential. So the mainland has sponsored a lot of policies to tap the research capability of Hong Kong's universities. Well, going back to the 3 developments that may threaten Hong Kong's position. Number 1, US-China geopolitical context. This is not entirely negative, as Beijing may value Hong Kong's international connectivity more, and the external environment is hostile. I mean, if you look back to the Korean War, Cold War, precisely because the external environment is very hostile, and that was why Beijing attached such an importance to Hong Kong at that time. Second factor, increasing openness and competitiveness of mainland cities. Mainland cities certainly have surpassed Hong Kong in some areas. For example, container throughput is an obvious example. However, Hong Kong is still unique in many ways. With successful and economic development, the mainland can utilize Hong Kong's uniqueness better. Okay. For example, as many Chinese companies have developed to the stage that they can go global and they will benefit from going global, they can better utilize Hong Kong's platform to really raise their international profile. And what I'm saying is, the more developed, advanced mainland cities have become, they may find Hong Kong all the more important and valuable. They will be able to, because Hong Kong is unique by historical and other circumstances. Beijing's alarm over Hong Kong's separatist sentiment and so on. Again, this is not entirely negative, as the previous system has led to deadlock and stalemate. It didn't work. And people do it. Didn't work. It took 6 months to elect a chair of a standing committee of the electoral. Okay, the system. As long as Beijing is cognizant of Hong Kong's uniqueness, Hong Kong may have a fresh start under one country, 2 systems. Last 2 comments, seeing the future is beyond social science. Too many variables and involved. And I believe history is not preordained. Negatives can be turned into positives and vice versa. Okay. That is all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sean. So like I mentioned before, we're going to have some questions, and the speaker will be answering questions. But I'd like to open up with 3 questions myself, perhaps take advantage of being the moderators, and to get the dialogue started here. For Professor Cheng, and I wanted to ask the question about, maybe just play a devil's advocate here. And when we look at issues about the global city versus just another city, I can say that my experiences of teaching Chinese government official, I think a lot of Chinese city want to be another Chinese city. And a lot of the cities, they are very, made a lot of efforts try to do something different. And then more importantly, a lot of cities wanted to develop themselves into global city. If you look at what happened in those, of course, what happened to Shanghai, what happened to Shenzhen, and generally you see that really they are quite different compared to 20, 30 years ago. Right? I mean, if you don't really, they're not really just another city. They definitely qualify in some dimension as a global city here, right? So just draw another analogy, because we are in the education sector here. If you look at, right now, the worry sometimes the university is that with the Hong Kong University just become another Chinese university, right? So I would like to draw that analogy. But if you look at these days, to top mainland Chinese university, like I went when I visit Tsinghua University, Shanghai Jiaotong, you'd be amazed how many international students study in those places, and really more and more. And by comparison, I would say that despite of all these advantages, unique advantages, and also English being the language instruction, and there are really not many international students currently enrolled in the Hong Kong University here, right? So in that sense, I think that the question may not necessarily be worry about being another Chinese city. It could be that to what extent that the Hong Kong is losing the competitions of being a global city within the Chinese context here, right? That's the same way as a university in Hong Kong might be worried about whether or not they will be losing to the mainland elite universities and become global university, right, in that sense, right? So I think that's the question about what happened to Hong Kong, in that sense that given all these unique advantages and so forth here, and would we sort of be worried about is the losing competition, in becoming global cities, right? Or keeping its status, right? Compared to other the cities in China, try to want to be a global city. So for Professor 𝐇𝐨𝐧𝐠 Chen, I sense there's certain level of optimism in your discussion here, right? You talk about several key characteristics of what make a global financial centers, right? Some of the critical factors, some of the factors which and so forth here. You go down to the list of these factors here, you find that it seems like these advantages will be retained to a large extent for Hong Kong. Therefore, you are quite optimistic about Hong Kong keeping, in terms of the at least the competition within China to become, the global financial center. A lot other Chinese cities want to do the same thing. But I wonder if you look at what happened regionally. I have some friends working in financial industry in Singapore. My understanding is that they're definitely getting more business these days, and there's a lot of movement in terms of the I think a capital in terms of the location for these financial firms, and they are really thinking about it. Some of them actually relocating elsewhere here. So I wonder, whether or not this optimism that you express here will be shared widely among the market participants within Hong Kong, and whether or not there's a possibility Hong Kong might actually losing this competitive advantage compared to other cities within Asia, like Tokyo and Singapore and other places that would like to also increasing their potential advantages over Hong Kong, right? So to that extent, to what extent Hong Kong might actually under certain potential threat here, because all of these other major international hubs, they would mostly share with some of the characteristics you described. That you say the Hong Kong will retain, but other global center, they will continue to have that as well, right? So what would be the kind of the potential recent development, like a impact of recent development in Hong Kong on the Hong Kong's relative status? So for Professor Song, also that I sense there's a strong kind of optimism, right, in terms of describing, if you look at the change of trade and the FDI and so forth here, really looks like there's a little impact so far, I guess. But I wonder, to what extent that a lot of these descriptions seem to be based on the behaviors and actors of other big players. If you look at a lot of what happened in Hong Kong, can be in a way determined by decision made in other like big players, right, in the mainland China central government, and also some decision made by US and so forth here. So I wonder to what extent that if you look at the future development of Hong Kong in terms of trade, in terms of FDI, all these areas, would actually really depend on sort of the things that would be different. The decision would be made differently by people in Hong Kong. Professor Anthony earlier mentioned that it's up to Hong Kong in terms of how to really turn these unique advantages into advantage in the future here. So I wonder what sort of the kind of things need to be done differently in the context of Hong Kong, really to maintain these current advantages here, because a lot of US statistics is still about what happened largely before this development here. We still really, still try to understand what might be happening, right, 5 to 10 years from now. So these are kind of just three questions to start with.
Okay, maybe let me respond first, Shem. I think you're right. Other major cities, cities like Shanghai, Shenzhen, Guangzhou, and Chongqing, a lot more Beijing, they all try to be more international. In fact, becoming international is one of the selling points. If you look at their city plans, they all emphasize how international they are: international trade center, international financial center. Of course, the scale, when we talk about international, you have to be more specific. What do you mean by international? Is it just having more foreign firms, foreign traders coming in, or you are putting more emphasis on foreign language training? But Hong Kong's internationalness, I think, has partly to do with its sort of historical heritage, the legacy, what we have described, what Professor 𝐶𝐨𝐧𝐠 𝐂𝐡𝐢𝐧𝐵 has described earlier in his talk. And so I think it would be good if there are more cities on the mainland all sort of looking outward. I think China needs to look outward. And Hong Kong is not the only city that is sort of window to the world. I think there are many more gateways in China today compared to 30 years ago. But even if Shenzhen, Shanghai, for example, just to name these two, they have become more international. But Hong Kong's globalness is slightly different from them because of the common law linkage, because of Hong Kong throughout the British period was considered part of the Western world. So this connectivity, not physical one, but the sort of the historical connectivity is something quite distinct. And because of one country, two systems, and we know that the mainland system is so different. So no matter how international Shanghai and Shenzhen could become, these cities are still within the mainland system, the overall mainland system, which will be different from Hong Kong system. So my point is, Hong Kong as a global city will be quite different from, let's say, Shanghai as a global city of China. We are all part of China. And so the challenge really is both for the central government in Beijing as to whether it would prefer Hong Kong to continue on that journey to start with, and also whether Hong Kong is determined to play that role. Now, if for whatever reason Hong Kong goes down the road, Hong Kong goes into demise, I don't think Shanghai or Shenzhen will benefit. The city that will benefit will be Singapore. And actually, Singapore is now trying to gain advantage because of Hong Kong's trouble over the last couple of years. So I think this is really an important point that for Beijing's policy leaders to decide. Now, I can fully understand why the central government has decided to impose the national security law. I can well understand why it feels more comfortable if the police system is revamped, so to speak, to make sure that patriots in Hong Kong. I know where these initiatives come from. But at the same time, we must ensure that those elements, which are what Professor Chen has described as the hygiene factors for Hong Kong's status as a global city, those factors must be maintained. Otherwise, Hong Kong's value to China will diminish.
Perhaps I can also answer the question posed by Professor Wu. When I talk about the China factor, the China as a, what I said, the China factor supporting Hong Kong's market growth, I'm not referring to how the China factors, I'm not referring to how they affect Hong Kong competition with the cities in mainland. I think that question is very much decided. Hong Kong is very ahead of the other cities in mainland for the foreseeable future, so I don't really see Hong Kong losing that. In fact, China relies on Hong Kong as a global financial center for many of the financial activities and economic activities for the years to come. And the same question, the same reason, which is make me optimistic about Hong Kong vis-a-vis other Asian cities, is because China is very much behind Hong Kong. Because of China factor, Hong Kong financial market will be very big and very relevant. This is not something that Singapore and Tokyo and other cities can really take over, as a player for the Chinese financial economic interests. And so my thesis is that because of China importance, Hong Kong is important, and also because of the integration in the financial system, it's very difficult for the Western countries to exclude China, which makes Hong Kong play a very unique position. Now, you asked the question whether the financial market share my optimism. Of course, I hear many stories. There are many stories. People, companies opening up new offices, sending some of the trading team to Singapore away from Hong Kong. Yeah, you hear some of the stories, and it's taking place. But on the other hand, these are just I think these are just noises. Companies always do some hedging and so on, but they're not. I don't see any movement of moving away from Hong Kong. And especially, I think China in the financial market opening, China interest is to be open further and further because it is in China's interests. China's long-term economic emergence relies on an open financial market through Hong Kong, because in a way, through being through Hong Kong, you have a lot of protection, you have a lot of certainty. I see more China opening up in terms of the stock market, of course, going on, and the bond market and so on. I think a lot of these foreign institutions will definitely be continuing to operate in Hong Kong if they want to access the Chinese market, because a lot of financial market openings can be conducted only through Hong Kong, because of one country, two system. And Hong Kong is a system that China can trust, and that's not something that Singapore and Tokyo can really do.
Thank you. Okay, I guess I will just say a few words, John. Yeah, I think it is, of course, true that cities are getting more internationalized and cosmopolitan. is this a threat or is this an opportunity for Hong Kong? I mean, what we say is both a threat and an opportunity. I mean, it's a threat. I mean, if you don't do anything and you are very pessimistic, and which may become a self-fulfilling prophecy, and it can also be an opportunity, of course. I mean, more developed cities and consumers, I mean, can give a rise to more opportunities for us. And economic development is not a zero-sum game. I mean, as I said, mentioned in some of my slides, that the development of mainland cities may mean that they can utilize the Hong Kong platform to the advantage more, really Hong Kong more valuable. And so it's both a threat and an opportunity. I mean, it's not a zero-sum game. I mean, it depends on what we do. And I think obviously, I mean, China is big, the world is big. I mean, Hong Kong is small. I mean, we can only swim with the current, and that is what Hong Kong has been doing all along. In fact, in our history, that if you look back into the Korean War, this big crisis when the entrepreneurial trade in Hong Kong collapsed, and Hong Kong swung with the tide and overcome the crisis, and we hope that will happen. I mean, fundamentally, if you look at it, I mean, even sometimes I pose this question: so we wish mainland cities do well or do badly? Fundamentally, I mean, purely from a Hong Kong perspective, I think I would wish that they do well and develop fast rather than getting stuck and spiraling down. I mean, if the open door and economic policy in the mainland were to fail, it would be a disaster for Hong Kong and the whole world and for East Asia. And I mean, the whole world and the East Asian region will become extremely unstable and so on. I mean, we have a lot of refugee problems and so on that we can't handle. So fundamentally, I wish that my brothers across the boundary, I mean, will do well rather than do badly. If they do badly, I really worry a lot. If they do well, I think I'm more at ease.
Thank you. Okay, now let's attend to some questions posed by a participant and this policy dialogue. So let's start with the first by who here. Say, according to some observer, we are now entering perhaps the era of deglobalization or post-globalization, characterized by growing localization of global value chain and the formation of regional economy trade blocks based on countries sharing similar values and ideology. So in this diagnosis, if this diagnosis is correct, are we going to see more regional city rather than global city in the future? Is there any role for Hong Kong in this growing politicized and fragmentized global trading system? So I think this is perhaps relevant for all speakers. Yes.
Well, I think it would take a lot of time to go into this debate about deglobalization, post-globalization, or what you mean by global versus regional city. I don't think we have time for that. But I think the important point here is, even though there's a lot of backlash against the earlier phase of globalization, say right after the global financial crisis or now because of COVID-19, I think objectively speaking, the world is becoming more globalized. I mean, because of information flow, because of the disappearance of boundaries, different senses. But at the same time, you have tensions. So this is a world that we have to accept, a globalizing world But at the same time, a lot of localist sentiments, anti-global sentiments. And sometimes you find that anti-global actions take a global way of expression. So it's rather dialectic. And I think that that is the world we are living in. And therefore, but economically speaking, if Hong Kong cannot be global in the broad sense, I mean, global in my view covers a regional perspective as well. If Hong Kong is not able to go beyond its boundary, if Hong Kong is just an inward-looking city, I don't think that is a bright future for Hong Kong, because we have always been, our economy has always been externally oriented, our trade, our finance, even our city outlook. So I think that kind of global outlook is important for Hong Kong, while we are at the same time fully aware of the tensions of changing global politics. I mean, every country in the world, I mean, major country in the world is encountering the challenge of their own version of localism, nativism. Even in the US, what Trump represented, America first. So I think that is part of the new normal that we have.
I don't have anything to do.
Professor Chen? Okay, now let's get to some other question. What's the real mean about the one country, two system version 2.0? Is there OCTS 3.0 in the future?
Well, maybe I can respond to that question, because I introduced this notion of 2.0. In fact, there are people, there are commentators in Hong Kong, I won't name names here, who said we are now into one country, two system 4.0. They have identified different stages of the evolution of one country, two systems. But for me, the whole reason why I mentioned that we are now into one country, two systems 2.0 is we are really coming to the end of an era, so to speak, since reunification, since the 1980s, when this notion of one country, two systems was formulated. Because many of the original assumptions are found to be unsustainable. And the central government has changed its own perspective about one country, two systems. And so in different ways, we are in a very important juncture of the development of the evolution of one country, two systems. We are at the end of the previous phase. We are now at the beginning of, hopefully, a new phase, which can bring new dynamics. Now, whether or not there will be a 3.0, I will not preclude that, because oftentimes the discussion is such that people expect, okay, because Beijing has promised 50 years unchanged in the 1980s. So by 2047, theoretically, the previous commitment or undertaking of one country system should come to an end. But I think, in my view, if China is going into the world, if China is moving steadily towards modernity, a continuous process of modernity, and if China values Hong Kong's distinctness and the kind of different system in Hong Kong versus the mainland system, even though the mainland system in itself will also be evolving, I think there's all the more reason for Hong Kong to continue its special status. And therefore, by 2047, I would not think that Hong Kong would simply be fully sort of submerged into the mainland system. So if should that happen, of course, that is beyond my time, but should that happen, then the kind of one country, two systems framework from 2047 will be 3.0. But of course, it depends on many factors.
The question about, we talk about some of the new development here, including, I guess, the national security law and including this overhaul electoral system and so forth. There's several changes here. The question is that are these developments related to the needs of the majority in terms of basic, in terms of housing and the rising cost of living? So to what extent that these basic needs of Hong Kong people will be potentially addressed under this new development?
Okay, I say it's very difficult to know. Obviously, how does the change in the political system and the electoral system will it result in changing in the other policies? On the ground level, of course, there are going to be impacts, but it is very difficult to say. But what I can say is, I guess, it's Beijing's intention that this be the case, that it will clear the way, for Hong Kong to address, what they call basic contradictions, such as high real estate prices and so on. That is the wish of Beijing, that is clear. It also, the change in the electoral system removes some of the obstacles. Developers now are less politically powerful, in the composition of the electoral committee, and so some of the barriers to addressing housing needs and developing land, some of the barriers such as political statement, political backlog, and powerful interests of developers, some of these barriers have been removed. Okay. But whether it will be successful, nobody really knows. Let's hope that will be the case. Yeah.
Well, I think this is, if I may jump in, I think, of course, it's not really my expertise. But I think now we are, by changing the electoral system, we are now opening up an opportunity, or also a big task for the administration in the future to really take care of such urgent matters and dealing with this. So as Yang mentioned, the contradictions. And I think Hong Kong's problem doesn't really entirely rest on the developers' interests. we are a multipolar society where people have a lot of different kind of interests and prerogatives and priorities. So how do you, even if a very cooperative legislative council, decide on taking action that will, in the face of many different priorities, interests, from the citizens, I think that is a very difficult matter. And I hope, of course, I hope that they can succeed.
Yeah. So this question about how do you see the possible impact on the overseas investment sentiment towards Hong Kong, as U.S. is likely to engage with Europe to deal with a so-called assertive China. EU just unveiling a plan to cut its dependencies on China. So what will be the impact on overseas investment sentiment?
I'm not an expert on investment per se, but I think, of course, whatever major changes there will be in terms of China-Europe relations or China-US relations, there's bound to be an impact on Hong Kong, because Hong Kong's economy is such externally oriented, and Hong Kong still values its link with the Western world. So it's a larger question. It is really a question for the US or for EU, in this case, to consider. Now, I see the term assertive China being used in the question. I think that is something that the world, the Western world, has to recognize, because China is becoming stronger economically and in other aspects as well. And therefore, it is no surprise that China will become more assertive. And I'm sure in the same way, I mean, in a way, India is becoming more assertive. Russia is becoming more assertive. Japan had been assertive in the past, but in the 1980s, 1990s, when its economy became stronger. The US is assertive. So, I mean, this is part of the reality of global politics. But being assertive is not the same as being threatening. So how can you deal with assertive nations, assertive in different ways, soft power, hard military power, hard power? So this is a new normal for international relations. And we just hope that global politics will become more stable, despite the fact that you have rise of new nations, you have new players coming along.
I think I will add a little bit here. I mean, the change in Western or US sentiment for China is not just this year. I mean, in fact, it started quite a few years back. I mean, when Trump was elected into presidency and then starting the trade war and so on. I mean, so it has been Western attempts to contain or to restrict. I mean, investment in China has been going on for a few years. And so the latest events are just a accumulation or just what has been going on. And what China has done, I mean, in response to the trade war, was to open up its economy more and to try to attract more foreign direct investment by relaxing some of the controls, by liberalizing more. For instance, allowing majority ownership in the more sectors, including some financial institutions, I mean, allowing joint ventures and so on, allowing Tesla, I mean, for example, I mean, some auto plants to have majority control in China. And so, I mean, these opposing tendencies going on, the West trying to restrict investment in China and China trying to attract more foreign direct investment and open up more. If you look at the result, I mean, the statistics, I mean, how much foreign direct investment has been going on into China since 2017 or 2018, I mean, the start of the Sino-Soviet trade war. The answer is that, well, if you look at the statistics, more and more foreign direct investment is going into China. And the latest statistics, I mean, year 2020, China has overtook and surpassed the US to be the #1 host in the whole world, or #1 host of foreign direct investment. I think China is the only major economy where FDI, I mean, foreign direct investment keep increasing during the disaster of COVID-19. So when you get two opposing forces going on, I mean, the latest statistics is foreign direct investment is increasing. All the talk about decoupling and this and that is more talk than real action.
Thank you. Maybe we'll just, in the interest of time, just take one last question. I think there's a couple of questions that are related here. And it's mentioned that GBA is perceived as a threat rather than opportunity to Hong Kong people, especially to use. Many of them are against China. So as today's speakers are prominent academic and former senior government official at Hong Kong's major university, what role academic leaders like yourself can and should play to change that anti-China perception? Is alarming in recent surveys that a large proportion of today's youth wants to immigrate. So that's the last question. Okay, Professor Chen.
Very quick, because I love that question, because it's something that I feel that we are not doing enough to address. Is GBA a threat or opportunity? I feel that in a lot of the talk in our community, it gives, I think, our youth and many people the impression that by having a GBA plan, Hong Kong becomes sort of like secondary or subject to the whole regional development. And the talk of asking our youth, oh, just go to GBA, look for a job. I mean, it's kind of helpful advice, but sometimes it can produce a very a counter effect. I feel that we really should, as leaders, as university leaders, as leaders in community, I think we should really put this whole thing in the right perspective. I believe that the GBA development is a very good thing. It's good for the region, and Hong Kong definitely can take advantage of that. On the other hand, I feel that Hong Kong should also assert the strength of our own institutions. For example, in terms of the universities, I know that many universities are developing new campuses in the GBA, including HKUST. And I think it's a very good thing because they will contribute to development in GBA and also enhance the strength of the Hong Kong universities. I think we should always put the question in that way, that by helping to build in GBA, how is that leading to the enhancement of our own institution? That covers universities. It also covers, I believe, the whole research and development, the supply chain, the economic value chain, that I think that Hong Kong can be part of. But you cannot be a leader if you do not have a good agenda, if you do not have a good plan. I think Hong Kong should have our own model, of how we develop our institutions so that we can contribute both to development in the GBA as well as enhancing the strength and international connectivity of Hong Kong. I think we are all doing that. On the other hand, I'm sorry that there's no storytelling at that level. So people are very confused. But I think when we are doing that kind of things, we have in mind of not just doing something for GBA. We want to do something for Hong Kong as well. But the storytelling is very poor.
Well, I certainly share Professor Chen's views. In fact, our articulation, our storytelling is not being done well. Hong Kong, because we have to remember, Hong Kong is part of the GBA. So when we say we want to develop the GBA, if we make Hong Kong stronger, that's already part of the effort. Of course, we should not just confine ourselves to Hong Kong. GBA is a much larger platform. This is a larger sort of landscape for Hong Kong. But we must not forget that making Hong Kong stronger is directly contributing to the GBA. That's my first point. Secondly, as the person raising the question is mentioned, our young people, they do not have much confidence. They are more pessimistic. And this is also mentioned by another person in the audience. And I think it is a very important point, because if the younger generation do not have confidence, whether in Hong Kong or in Hong Kong's institutions, Hong Kong's role within the GBA, within the nation, then that would not help Hong Kong. So that is also an equally challenging task for Hong Kong. How can we make young people have a more positive attitude, have more confidence in Hong Kong? I think what happened in Hong Kong over the last couple of years still requires a process of reconciliation, a process of closure. And unfortunately, I don't think the government has done too much in that respect. And I think if we don't address those internal questions, even though Hong Kong is still well positioned to play this global city role, and despite international politics, I don't think we can be that effective. And I think I need to address the question asked by Ming Chiu, because she's quite anxious that I should answer it. I think regarding the impact of the new electoral or revised electoral system, of course, we probably need another seminar to debate that. But just on the point of whether the pro-democracy candidates can join the future electoral, I think certainly they can, because the whole, I mean, in principle, the whole requirement is that candidates, they are sort of, broadly speaking, patriotic, and there are legal stipulations of whether or not you are patriotic. I mean, the national security legislation laid down the legal requirements. So I think so long as candidates, whichever political party or camp it comes from, so long as they are in line with these general requirements regarding patriotic, then they can join. And I don't think it is for government or for the central government officials to say, okay, you can join or you cannot join. I think we are talking about a system, and a system should have very objective, transparent requirements regarding eligibility.
Okay, so I guess that's end our today's policy dialogue, and I'd like to thank the three speakers for the wonderful session today. There's a lot of sentiment, I would say, involved in the issues, because they're very important, so that there's a sort of different sentiments that got developed here. But today's speaker actually discussed these aspects that we actually should consult with history, historical development. We should consult with reasoning. We should consult with some fundamental here, really to kind of see beyond these kind of sentiment. I think this is quite important. Another takeaway that I have is that it ultimately the future of Hong Kong will depend on the choices made by the government and the businesses in Hong Kong. And a lot of these external factors here, they cannot really be treated as truly external. They are also endogenous. A lot of these things happen, and also policies taken by others here also depended upon the decision and what happened in Hong Kong itself. So ultimately, I agree with Professor Anthony Chang mentioned earlier, is to up to Hong Kong and to shape Hong Kong's future, given these different external environment, and also this is still early day for us to assess the full impact of this new development here. I think that in the future, that much more efforts should go into this to really rigorously understand these issues here, so that the different segment of the society will be able to join this efforts to understand this impact, but also make their own contribution to contribute to Hong Kong future. So thank you all very much for attending today's session. I look forward to seeing you again in our next policy dialogue.